chapters, we were talking about the problems that African Americans face in our society today and how race does matter, specifically with market culture, the culture of consumption, intense African American poverty, white supremacy, and then how this results in nihilism and a collective existential angst within the African American community. So in chapter 5, Cornel West discusses a solution that's been proposed for this, which is affirmative action. And when a lot of people talk about affirmative action, it's such a contentious issue. There's a lot of misunderstanding about it. But Cornel West basically believes affirmative action is a necessary policy that needs to happen, but it's not the end-all be-all solution. So he says that, okay, affirmative action is here to help specifically with the poverty, the intense poverty that is disproportionately experienced compared to other racial groups within the African American community. And so he says that you have a huge wealth gap between African Americans and white individuals when it comes to income and wealth. Think about how wealth is intergenerational. And if you have a group of people who've been prevented from owning property for decades and decades and decades, well then all of a sudden just allowing people to own property does not mitigate for the loss of intergenerational wealth. And so we still see this really intense wealth inequality. We also still see the wage gap between African Americans and white individuals in the US. And so therefore, this is a reality. Black poverty is a reality. We see job discrimination, we see a lack of opportunity, and we see this huge gap. So affirmative action then would seem to be an okay solution to this issue. So let's think about affirmative action. Cornel West talks about, a lot of us have a misunderstanding about affirmative action, but if you have two equally qualified individuals, right, then they might specifically choose the person of color or choose the woman based off of the discrimination that these groups of people have faced. But sometimes people have the misperception that, oh yeah, it's, they're just going to randomly choose the black person who's less qualified than the white person who worked really hard. Well, that's not really what affirmative action is meant to be. The idea is that both people are equally qualified, but then based off of the centuries of discrimination that one group has faced, then specifically picking that person could help at least deal with the poverty and the intense discrimination that's occurred. But of course, affirmative action should not be an end-all be-all. So he says, yes, we need a race-based and gender-based affirmative action, which is what we do have. But he sees affirmative action as more of a negative solution, negative not in terms of it being a bad thing, but negative in terms of it being something that prevents America's weak will towards racial and gender justice from coming back full force. And so he says that, yeah, ideally we should live in a society where we don't need affirmative action. But if we don't have affirmative action within the epoch or the time period that we're in, then America's discrimination and, as he says, weak will towards racial justice will come back with full force. So we need something like that to prevent this from occurring. But we also need more of a positive measure as well, not something that just prevents discrimination, but something that also helps that specific community. And so that's why we have to think about important structures that do need to change. And of course, all of the behavioral issues he's talking about with self-love and leadership and unity. And therefore, we have to kind of identify and examine Black identity and cultivate this Black self-love, as he says, because that will help with internalizing more of an empowered sense of agency than this sense of nihilism and hopelessness. He says we do have to have multiracial alliances. And so that's kind of the overall idea behind this chapter on affirmative action.